Can I buy a magic item? It's a pretty innocent question on the surface, but in reality it's a very difficult question for the DM to answer in 5th edition. The only real rules we get for actually trading magic items are downtime rules, and while downtime rules are fine, it's not the magical experience you would want to be associated with actually dealing with magic items. So in this video I'll go over what you need to think about if you want to give your players a place where they can spend their hard-earned gold in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. First off, my name is J.A. Valeur with Eventyr Games. This video is actually part 2 in a mini-series on making the trade of magic items possible in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. In the first video we went into pricing magic items. You'll find a link to that somewhere around here. Just like the last time, this video is sponsored by ourselves and the Kickstarter Wanderer's Guide to Merchants and Magic, which is, in our opinion, the definitive guide to trading magic items in 5th edition. I'll be rolling a video right about now. So as you can see, Wanderer's Guide to Merchant Magic has everything you need to trade magic items 5th edition, from ready-to-play shops, new magic items, rules and guidelines for haggling. But that's not all this video is going to be about. What we're going to be talking about is how you can make actually shopping for magic items interesting for players and what you need to think about before you let your players go out into the world to shop magic items. The Dungeon Master Guide basically tells us that unless you decide your campaign works otherwise, most magic items are so rare that they aren't available for purchase. Even when they are, it's likely to remain similar to the market for fine art in the real world, with invitation-only auctions and a tendency to attract thieves. The Dungeon Master Guide also tells us that selling magic items is difficult in most D&D worlds, primarily because of the challenge of finding a buyer. Then we also get some guidelines for how we can locate magic items or buy and sell magic items during downtime, including rolling tables for how long it takes to find a buyer and how much that buyer would be willing to pay for an item. Xanathar's Guide to Everything expands upon this a little by giving us some better rolling tables with possible complications, but it still treats the buying and selling of magic items exclusively as a downtime activity. Now, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with downtime activity, but it seems like the rules both want magic items to be extremely exclusive and rare and mystical and magical and all that, but it also wants to handle the trade of magic items as downtime activities, which sort of cheapens the feel and takes the magical out of it. In addition, role-playing is also an important part of the game. It is a role-playing game, after all. So while you don't want to roleplay every little scenario and shopping trip, the actual buying and selling of important, powerful magic items, I think really needs a role-playing situation. That of course puts a lot of pressure on the DM, who's running that shop. What are they selling? What does it cost? How do they protect themselves against long-fingered characters and other robbers? And all of the minutiae that goes into actually having a place where magic items are sold and bought. So first, what does a magic shop look like? Well, the answer is that it can really look like anything. The most important thing, I think, is that there's something magical and mystical about it, some defining element that really shows the players that this is just not an ordinary shop, it is something out of the ordinary. That can be the merchant behind the counter, which we'll get to in just a second, or it can be the security measures. Maybe there's a glittering force field covering every item in the shop, or there's nothing at all in the shop because the items aren't even there. The merchant shows them as illusions when they want to show the players what they got on the shelves, and so on. As for who runs the magic shop, that's the same as designing any other NPC. When you're putting together an important NPC, you will of course want to know what's their motivation, what's their personality like, and maybe have a single quirk that this merchant has that sort of makes them stand out in the memory of the players. So that could be a dragonborn merchant who only has 3 fingers, who dislikes rogues and sorcerers because of previous interactions. Stuff like this is what you would usually want to think about when designing any NPC. What I think is important for a magic merchant in particular is that you also think about which sort of biases does the character have. Is there some characters that it would probably give a better deal than others? Maybe, as I mentioned, the Dragonborn dislikes rogues and sorcerers. it had an ex-fiancé who was a rogue sorcerer, or a bad experience with some adventurers. Another thing you'll also want to consider is how powerful the NPC are, because a regular merchant or innkeeper doesn't really have to be that powerful. They're not selling anything of particular value, but an merchant in a magic shop will either need to have some very powerful magical defenses or be very powerful itself, so that it can protect said wares even from the characters if they get the idea that maybe knocking over this place is easier than killing a dragon and taking all that magical loot. And that leads us to the next point, which is the shop's magical protections. Now, an ordinary shop wouldn't probably need magical protections, but a magic shop surely needs it, not only because the players may decide to try and rob or steal from the place themselves, but also so it sort of makes sense to them why someone else hasn't done it already. One thing you can do, as previously mentioned, is making the merchant very powerful in itself, but you can also give it guardians. Maybe it has a companion that could be a pet or a dog or a dragon that's in the back room, also keeping an eye on the items. Another thing to do is consider how magic and especially extra dimensional places can help keep the wares protected, especially when the merchant isn't around. Maybe it packs up all the magical items. The sample we have for Wanderer's Guide to Merchants and Magic is actually a shop that is in an extra dimensional space, which means that it's not there at night if the characters decided that they wanted to try and rob the place. You can also have the wares not be in the shop. That's another way to do it, where maybe the characters can see illusions of the magical items that are on sale. They can go through a list of the magical items, but the actual magical items are somewhere else entirely. And when the characters decide to make a purchase, the merchant will say, all right, give me just a second, I'll go fetch these magical wares. There could also be an enchantment on each magical item that sort of anchors it to this place, so that if they try to take it out of the shop, they will start the alarm, or maybe they'll be cursed or set up some magical trap that is very dangerous. So to actually be allowed to leave the shop with the item, the merchant has to put it through some sort of disenchantment, just like you would have a security chip on wares in a clothing store, for example. Last but not least, there's of course also the shop's items. What does it have for sale and how much does it cost? This is one of the most time-consuming parts of setting up your own magic shop, because you will not only have to go through the book and consider which magic items would my players want and which would the characters be interested in, but you also have to have enough ready so that when a character inevitably goes, well, I'm looking around, which magic items do I see? You'll be ready to give a description of an item here, an item there, and an item over here, so that the shop doesn't just seem empty because there's only that one item that we're looking for. So of course this is something that takes a lot of prep work, and it's also something that we're focused on in Wanderer's Guide to Merchants and Magic, making as easy as possible by having an inventory list for each merchant, complete with one sentence descriptions. And also, which is the next point, the price of the item. Because prices in 5e are notoriously hard, with these price ranges that can go from 500 to 5,000 gold for a rare item and so on. The whole science of pricing magic items is something that I went over in the first video in this series, so I won't do that again. You can watch that by clicking a link somewhere. But what I will say is that it's good to actually just have thought a bit about the prices before you let your players go in there. There's nothing worse than the player characters deciding that they want this particular item, and you'll have to consider in the moment, okay, how much will it mess up the balance of the game if they get this item? What should I price it at? Can they afford that? Being aware of how much gold roughly the characters have, and when you want them to have access to a magic item, and how much gold or how big of an investment you want it to be to buy a magic item is something that's very good to have thought about beforehand. What I think is also good to do is go in and say, okay, how can the players get this magic item from the shop without actually buying it with their gold? That could mean trading it for some of their own magic items, but it could also mean doing some task or another for the magic merchant that is in the shop. These sort of quest hooks is not only a good way to fill out a session where you don't have anything in particular planned, or just to throw some extra adventure in there and make the world feel more alive when the merchant suddenly goes, yeah, well, you won't be able to afford this flaming broadsword that I had, but if you go ahead and deal with my competitor over here by poisoning the well and tearing down their marketing posters in the square or what have you, then I'll consider selling it to you at half price and so on. Putting in this sort of mini quest inside the actual encounter with a magic merchant is something that can really elevate it, and also perhaps make the merchant a recurring character in the character's adventure. And as I've mentioned a few times already, the Wanderer's Guide to Merchants and Magic will contain everything that I've discussed in this video for 20 shops, alongside rules for hackling magic items, 100 new magic items and also price lists for all the magic items in the 5th edition system reference document. The Kickstarter campaign launches today. You can check it out in a link in the description below, as well as a pinned comment that I'll be putting down there as well. It would be awesome to have your support. The more pledges we can get for the book while it is in the Kickstarter launch phase, the better we can make the book, with contributions from other creators, as well as more art, content, handouts, and so on. We also have Michael E. Shea from Sly Flourish, the publisher of Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide, and also Anne Gregersen, who is known for her work on Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, who will also be supplying a merchant each when we reach certain stretch goals in the campaign. So yeah, check that out, and I hope that you get to create some awesome magic shops in your game. Beyond that, there's nothing else to say than thank you for watching, and I hope that I'll see you in the next video.